Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I wanted to return to the subject of how you build a story. If you haven't seen my first video on this subject, I will link it down in the description below. It's called How to Build a Story from the Top Down. Today I wanted to look at things from the other side of the equation, namely how you build a story from the bottom up. If you're curious about what I mean by that, I do cover it in my previous video, but very quickly, a bottom-up story begins with a certain component of the story, a character, a situation, or a motivation that you want to explore in depth, and then you build a story around that. So let's talk about building a story from the bottom up using a short story I wrote in exactly that fashion. A Eulogy for Morgan Hale is a short story that is available on my blog, link down below, which I built from the bottom up. Some time ago, I read a novel where the hero intervened to prevent the outright murder of a villain. And this man was a villain. Very terrible crimes, many hundreds dead, sadism, that kind of thing. This was a person who would be rightly executed if given trial in any court of law, assuming, of course, the death penalty was allowed in that court. However, there are a number of very good reasons not to simply execute the person on the spot. I can also think of a bunch of good reasons to do that. However, the hero of the story only offered one. If the villain was executed, she said, it would just mean one more mother mourning, like all the other mothers mourning for their dead that day. No one had any response to this, and I thought that was terrible writing. The result of that intuition was the story A Eulogy for Morgan Hale. So how did I get from that prompt to that story? Well, what bothered me about this particular scenario was not so much the outcome, because, as I said before, I can see a number of good arguments for not outright executing a villain, even one guilty of terrible crimes. But it's a very difficult thing to do, and I would have expected it to be more of a struggle, given human nature. So I decided to write a story about that struggle. What does it look like when characters struggle over whether it is right to simply take away a life without any process, without any chance at redemption, in the face of terrible crimes? With that in mind, I asked myself, is there any character I already have who would be suitable to that kind of story? I could always create a new character, of course, but why go to all the extra effort for a very small, limited scope story if I already have a character suited to it? And, as it turns out, I did. Roy Harper is a professional monster killer and bounty hunter. Bounties are typically put on criminals, so hey, here's the perfect character to examine this basic idea. So, beginning from the bottom up, I start with my basic idea, and I ask, does this idea readily connect to characters and concepts I am already writing? If so, I almost always try to do a bottom-up story by connecting it to something larger. Again, this isn't an ironclad rule, this is just what I do. I am primarily a top-down guy. I like my big characters and my big ideas. It gives me a lot of clarity and structure as I write a story. And one of the first things I knew as I began to write A Eulogy for Morgan Hale was that, given who he was, Roy Harper was going to be on the against side. He was not going to be in favor of sparing the life of Morgan Hale. He's a very disciplined, very strict man. If one man kills another for selfish reasons, well, Roy is probably going to be happy to see him executed for his crime. With the core concept worked out and the side of my main character decided, I needed an antagonist. Now, again, I started writing this story with a very specific inspiration, and since the protagonist of the story I was responding to was female, and made an argument grounded in a very feminine sensibility, I chose to write the antagonist as a woman and the wife of the villain's victim. Just for good measure, I named her Mercy Templeton, in case there were any questions about what the story's actually about. Finally, I put together the framing device. Initially, I was thinking I would write this story just as a confrontation between Roy and Mercy. But that lacked a little bit, and it made exposition rather difficult. I needed people who would not immediately understand the conflict between Roy and Mercy, so that they could talk about it, so that the different sides of the argument could be examined a little bit. And so I came up with the idea of framing the story not as the immediate confrontation, but as Roy appearing at a funeral. I chose a funeral for a very specific reason. Without getting too deep into other stories, I have known what the funeral rites in the religion of the mated pair, which is the primary religion in Colombia, I've known what these look like for some time. They're pretty important to another story, which I've not actually written out yet. Typically, what is done is the friends and loved ones of a deceased man or woman show up at the hearth fire, which is the central religious structure in most towns, and they build a funeral pyre by taking a piece of firewood, retelling a short, treasured memory about the deceased person, and then adding that wood to the pyre. Once the pyre is fully built, it is lit from the central hearth fire, and the person's body is cremated. However, if there is someone in the community who does not look on the deceased person's life with good opinion, they can come to the funeral, remove a piece of wood from the funeral pyre, and throw it into the central fire. They're not expected to talk any. The funeral is primarily for the mourners, after all, but they do have an opportunity to publicly show exactly what they think of a person one last time. Roy arrives at the funeral for Morgan Hale with Hale's wanted poster in hand, and a pretty grim story to tell a village full of people who always found the local carpenter and woodworker to be a pretty upstanding guy. In this way, Roy kind of becomes the antagonist of the story. He is entering a village of people who think very well of a man and telling them some very dark secrets about him. That also fits well with the eventual outcome I wanted to arrive at. See, my problem with the story that I read which prompted a eulogy for Morgan Hale was not the outcome. I do tend to agree that you should not arbitrarily execute people for perceived crimes, no matter how great they are. I do believe there is always room for redemption and mercy. But I do believe it is a lot harder, and it is a lot darker a path than many people give it credit for. So, while Roy was the right character to take on this story, ultimately, his point of view could not win out in the end and still give me the story I wanted. Which is why I chose to have Roy leave the piece of firewood he initially takes off the pyre back on the pyre with the wanted poster at the end of the story. He does lose this round because his position, while sometimes correct, is not always, and he had to be ready and prepared for that. So, that is how I go about building a story from the bottom up. I begin with a concept, and I apply it to the most likely character or piece of continuity that I am already working on. Then I examine it to see how it connects with other existing tidbits of lore or other ongoing events. I ask what the most likely outcome is, and whether I'm okay with that, or whether I should add more elements to the story to get an outcome I prefer more. At that point, I'm about ready to start outlining and committing the story to the page. From there, I enter my writing process as normal, and again, I have written a series of blog posts on my writing process, which you can read by following the link down in the description below. So, if you want to know more about that, check out those posts. Again, let me know if you would like to see a series of videos covering some of those concepts on the channel. I would be happy to make those, but I really think seeing these concepts written out is the better way to go about getting a handle on them. And let me know whether you prefer a bottom-up or a top-down writing methodology when you're putting together a story. While you're down there leaving those comments, there's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.